Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today we are continuing the Gambit series with the Maróczy Gambit in the fantasy Caro-Kann. Now I should say, of all the Gambits in the playlist, this is probably the only one that's absolutely sound. It's the best way for white to play, so you're not really risking anything, you're not compromising your position, and it comes after black has made a small mistake. So in the fantasy Caro-Kann, there are many ways for black to play. I used to play e6 all the time. All of my tournament games were e6, that's the safest choice. Queen b6, excuse me, is what I play now, because it's very interesting and it's an improvement to the line you're about to see. The Maróczy Gambit starts in what used to be the main line 100 years ago, which is d takes e4, and in itself, d4 is a strange positional decision because the only reason white plays f3 in the fantasy variation is to support the e4 pawn without having to play knight c3. And ideally for white wants to recapture on e4 with the pawn and get this two-pawn center for which black has absolutely zero compensation. So if black plays passively and plays, I don't know, e6 or knight f6 or knight d7, then black is just going to be worse because white is controlling all the key central squares. So what used to be the main line 100 years ago is still the third most popular variation today, e5. And the point behind e5 is that you're trying to undermine and destroy white's center before they can use it. And taking this pawn is really a big mistake, and it has almost never been played. The point behind this is that black is able to trade queens and then slowly develop, I don't know, bishop e6. These pawns are about to fall, you can round them up, and obviously black has a lead in development, white's structure is bad. So after e5, white plays the move knight f3, and black now, well, is hanging a pawn. f6 would be a devastating mistake because the queen can come to h5 and black would very quickly lose, so black takes. And now white could recapture the pawn, but that's just better for black. For example, queen d4, knight d4, and black has an isolated pawn with no compensation, so no reason to do that. Instead, after ed, white plays the move bishop to c4, the Maróczy Gambit. And it's called a gambit because you have not recaptured your pawn. It's not really possible for black to keep that pawn. In most variations, black is just going to give the pawn back, and I'm going to show you why this is great for white, why this is dangerous for black, and how you can lose this as black in a couple of moves, and how you can fight to keep relative equality. In all lines, this is better for white. As I said, black has already made a mistake. So what should black do here? Your pawn is hanging, and there are a couple of ways to defend it. The best engine move is bishop to g4, avoiding the Maróczy Gambit. And now, of course, if the pawn is taken, it has to be taken with the d-pawn, and once again you trade queens and you have a better structure. What I think is the best move after e5, knight f3 is bishop e6. And now you really don't want to take. Black just keeps developing. The point is, I'm going to play knight d7 without blocking in my bishop. If you take with the pawn, I can play knight d7 or trade queens. Trading queens is what I would do. And if you take with the knight, then black already has an advantage because the e-pawn is hanging. So queen h4 check, you have to move the king, I don't know where, here for example, and now queen e4 is just enough. So the move bishop e6 is what I would recommend for black if you play this variation with d takes e4, f takes e4, and e5, knight f3. Bishop e6 and bishop g4 are good playable moves. ed4 a mistake, and white plays the Maróczy Gambit. Now, I'm going to show you the bad moves first, and I'm going to show you the moves that lose immediately. First of all, there are a couple of moves we should consider. Knight f6, which may seem scary to most people because of e5, but if e5 happens, then we have knight d5. We will get to that. Knight f6 is the best move. The second best move probably is knight d7, which prepares knight f6 and further defends against e5 in some cases. And the two moves that are simply bad are trying to develop your bishops. Bishop e7 loses straight away. It's just, on a high level, it's a losing blunder. On our level, it's losing according to the engine. You may still mess up, but it's a great advantage to white. And bishop e6 is also a very bad mistake. So let's look at the worst move first, bishop e7. If you have white in this position, and your opponent plays bishop e7, which is seemingly a natural move, preventing knight g5, then you can be very happy. Now, the point behind this bishop c4 idea, as is the case in most king-pawn openings, the f7 pawn is weak. And obviously, if you don't play bishop e7, there is knight g5, there is also knight e5, and your knight is still on g8, you cannot castle. So white is putting pressure on f7. Therefore, bishop e7 makes a lot of sense trying to defend against knight g5, but it doesn't work. White castles, and as you can see, now the rook has joined in the attack on f7, and the knight will come very quickly to g5, and there is going to be triple pressure. You don't have time to develop. You don't have time to castle. If you play knight f6, then it's game over straight away. Knight g5, defending the pawn on e4, attacking the pawn on f7. You have no way to keep the material. If you go bishop e6, I just take on e6 with the bishop, f takes, knight takes, then I take on g7 with check if you save your queen, and busted. So most people would castle because it doesn't seem like you're going to be losing material because f7 is defended twice. However, notice this rook, notice the e-pawn. Once the king ends up on f7, we can play e5, the knight is pinned to the king, and we win a piece back with a huge initiative. So we start by playing knight f7. This must be captured. If you move your queen, then I can move my knight anywhere with a discovered check. So rook f7, bishop takes, king takes, and e5. And obviously after e5, we are going to get the piece back. We are going to be up in exchange with a winning position. On bishop e7 castles, black doesn't have to blunder knight f6. Black can play knight d7. And knight d7 is no better. This is even worse. Bishop takes f7 now, and you can see that we have multiple good discoveries. King f7 is forced. If you go king to f8, then I still have discoveries, but you haven't taken my piece. So king takes f7, knight g5 check, and king e8 is the best move. King g6 loses very simply to knight f7. I just pick up a full rook. That's simple enough. So on knight g5, king e8, I can go knight e6. I can go knight f7. In this position, I think knight e6 is better than knight f7, although knight f7 is also good. The queen needs to save itself. So let's say queen a5, and now simply knight g7 check. And on king d8, well, knight e6 check, forcing the king back. King e8. You can now go rook f5. You can prepare queen h5. You have so many pleasant choices. So, long story short, if in this position black plays bishop e7, white is simply winning. Just put pressure on the f7 pawn. Now, the second bad move is bishop e6. It makes a lot of sense from a human perspective because, you know, you're trying to defend f7. However, we take, f takes, and we simply castle. And now you can see that this king is never going to be safe. Even if you had enough time to move your bishop out, to move your knight out, you're not going to be castling. As soon as I move my knight, castling will be restricted. So what can we look at for black? I mean, you can play weird moves like knight a6 or queen d6 that don't do anything. But let's say knight f6, which tries to castle. Notice how the e-pawn is mobile. So e5. And now you can play knight d7, which is losing. You can play knight d5, which is losing. I'm going to show you how. And you can play knight e4, which is the move that the engine gives us +2, so losing on a high level, but is the best move. If knight d5, let's look at that first. We go knight to g5. And I really don't know what to suggest now for black. If you make a random move, let's say a6, then I go knight f7 and I just take the rook in the corner, even if you do save your queen. So how do you defend f7? I don't think you can. I don't know. It's just, you're going to lose the rook. If you try moving the rook to g8 in anticipation of knight f7 so that you can save both pieces, then queen h5. And if you go g6, then queen h7. And once again, you resign. If you try rook g7, then rook takes f8. And you're losing. Knight e6 check, and bye-bye. So, yeah, nothing works. On knight e5, the engine says the best move after knight g5 is knight e3. I don't know what to say about knight e3. It just doesn't do anything. We can take, and after takes, queen d8, king d8, and knight f7. Knight f7 isn't even the best move according to the engine, but it would just take the rook. So on bishop e6, white is almost winning. After castles, knight f6, e5, knight d5 loses. Knight e4 is the best engine move, but it's still extremely bad. And I'm going to show you a move you would never think of yourself in this position. The best move is knight e1. Now, what does knight e1 do? It opens up the rook. Okay, instead of going forward, since the knight on e4 defends the g5 square, we're just planning to pick up the knight with queen f3, threatening mate and the knight. The only solution, if you try, let's say, bishop e7, you're easily losing to queen g4, and it's just a double attack, and on e6 and the knight, and on g7 a triple attack. So the best move should be queen d5 defending the knight, and now queen f3 anyway. Really hard to make a move for black. The engine says king d8 is good, knight d7 is good. It's all losing, but those are the moves that survive. Remember, b7 is also hanging. So, bishop e7 losing, bishop e6 very, very close to losing. So let's look at the good moves. Knight d7 is definitely playable. And white can castle here, or white can play knight g5. Knight g5 doesn't work. It's a mistake, because now the point behind knight d7, we can defend f7. Knight e5, tempo on the bishop, defending f7. Now you have to save the bishop. You don't have an f-pawn to chase my knight away, and black has a big advantage, so don't do that. On knight d7, black wants to play knight e5, so we just castle. Knight gf6, and there are a couple of ways to play this. You can play e5, which is a fine move according to the engine, but I prefer the move queen e1. And again, white shouldn't care about this pawn. Just don't leave the pawn. Don't attack the pawn. Now, if black doesn't do anything, let's say black plays bishop e7, trying to develop. Now e5 is much stronger. Once the knight moves to d5, we can take, and go queen g3. Now, good luck. If you castle, I have bishop h6. If you play g6, I have knight d4, followed by e6. So it's very, very bad. Which is why I prefer the move queen e1. And black, of course, has ways to defend. It's plus 0.56 for white. The best move is knight b6, developing your bishop and gaining a tempo on the bishop on c4. So bishop b3, bishop e6. In this case, this really shouldn't be taken because the knight is covering the f7 square. So you just continue playing from there. You can start developing your pieces. Knight bd2 is good, knight g5 is okay, king h1 is okay, clearing this diagonal so that there are no more tricks. And it's a playable position in which white is slightly better. Of course, you can also regain your pawn at some point, but you shouldn't. So for all of you who play the Caro-Kann, if you face the fantasy variation, my first piece of advice is do not go into this line with ed4. My second piece of advice is, in this position, play knight f6. That is by far the most comfortable move. e5 does not work here, so don't be afraid of playing knight f6. If e5, we go knight d5, and the bishop is successfully blocked. White now has nothing better but to take on d4, and for some reason white has an isolated pawn on e5. So not e5. White needs to continue aggressively with castles once more. If in this position white tries to move knight g5, once again it does not work because of a trick. We can go bishop e6 in this position. And it may seem strange to go bishop e6 here. If knight takes, pawn takes, if white gets greedy with bishop takes, then there is queen e7. And we're forking the bishop and the pawn. If you try bishop f5, I can just go g6. And if bishop takes, pawn takes, knight takes, we once again go queen e7. If you try knight g5 to defend that pawn, then h6. If you go knight c5, I take the knight. And basically you're going to lose this pawn with check, and black has a big advantage. So on castles, knight g5, knight g5 isn't playable. White should castle. Now all the lines with knight g5 actually do work. So there is only one good move here. If we go bishop e7, we run into the same problems we saw with bishop e7 very early on. Knight g5, castles, and now once again knight f7, rook f7, bishop f7, king f7, e5, and the game is over. So in castles, we go knight d7. Now, if white should try knight g5 here, then once again, knight e5, defending f7, putting pressure on the bishop. It doesn't work. So knight bd7, if e5, then once again we have knight d5, and everything is successfully defended. So knight bd7, for white, I would once recommend the move queen e1. And let's look at what black can do. If you play bishop e7, we saw this already, you are losing to e5, knight d5, and queen g3. Castles, queen h6. If you go g6, I take on d4. So once again, we go into the same line where on queen e1, black needs to play bishop b6, white goes bishop b3, sorry, knight b6, bishop b3, and white has a slight edge after bishop e6. So to sum up, the Maróczy Gambit is an opening that's really good for white. It comes after black has already made a mistake. You're not risking anything. If you get this on the board, be happy. Now, my final recommendation for black in this position, do not go takes, go queen b6. This queen b6 line is now the modern variation. This is what the top players play. And the point is that after knight c3, now we take. And now we go e5. And the difference is, with our queen on b6, we're putting pressure on the f2 square and on the d4 pawn. And if white tries knight f3, which is the most common move, then we take. Okay, and now bishop c4 doesn't work because there's a knight here. So we would take the knight. So try queen b6 and have a look at my tournament and training games. I have plenty in this line. I hope you liked the video. Let me know what you think and stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.